She had driven away every man who ever worked her land, and she was proud of it. But the morning Ethan Cade rode through the gate of Black Hollow Ranch with nothing but a worn bag, a tired horse, and eyes that had already seen the worst the world could offer, something shifted in the frozen air that even Vivian Mercer couldn't explain. She told herself he'd be gone by the first snow. She was wrong. And that mistake, that one quiet, stubborn mistake, would cost her every wall she had spent 11 years building around the ruins of her heart. If you've ever fought so hard to survive that you forgot how to live, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind coming down from the Carver Mountains didn't ask permission. It moved the way it always had across that stretch of Wyoming frontier, without warning, without apology, bending the tall grass flat against the frozen earth and pushing through every gap in every fence line like it owned the whole territory. Old-timers in the valley said you could judge the character of a man by how he stood in that wind. Some leaned into it, most turned away. Ethan Cade stood completely still. He sat on his horse at the top of the ridge overlooking Black Hollow Ranch at just past 6 in the morning, the October sky pressing down gray and low above him, and he studied the land the way a man studies something he isn't sure about yet, but knows he needs. The ranch sprawled below him, main house built from dark timber at the center, bunkhouse and stables to the east, cattle pens stretching a quarter-mile toward the frozen creek, and beyond all of it, the northern pastures disappearing into the foothills where the real work happened, where the real danger lived. It wasn't a beautiful ranch, it was a working one. There's a difference. The fences along the lower pasture needed attention. He could see that from up here, 2 posts leaning, a section of wire sagging between them like it had given up. The barn roof on the western side showed dark patches where water had gotten under the shingles and nobody had fixed it yet. There was a wagon sitting out in the yard with one wheel missing, just sitting there in the mud like a reminder of something left unfinished. Ethan noticed all of it. He noticed the way the cattle moved in the far pen too, restless, bunched too tight in the corner nearest the water trough, which meant the trough was either frozen or low. Somebody should have checked it an hour ago. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and read the address written on it one more time, even though he had read it 40 times already since leaving Cutter's Creek 4 days north. Then he folded it back, tucked it away, and nudged his horse down the ridge toward the gate. His name was Ethan Cade, and he was 32 years old, and he had been running from a version of himself he didn't want to be anymore for going on 3 years. Not running fast, not dramatically, just the slow, deliberate kind of running that looks from the outside like a man simply moving forward with his life. He had left his son Noah with his sister Margaret in the Northern Territories, a temporary arrangement that had stretched past temporary and was starting to feel like something else, something that kept him awake at 2 in the morning with a specific kind of guilt that no amount of hard work could fully quiet. Noah was 7. He had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and the last time Ethan had held him, the boy had asked when he was coming home, and Ethan had said soon in a voice that didn't carry nearly as much certainty as he'd wanted it to. He needed money. Steady work, steady pay, enough saved over a winter season to go back north and build something real. A house, a life, a reason for Noah to stop asking that question. Black Hollow Ranch was hiring. The pay was better than anything else in the territory. What the advertisement had not mentioned was why. The man who met him at the gate was named Cord Yates, the ranch foreman, a weather-beaten 50-something with a jaw like carved wood and the general energy of someone who had been awake since 4 and expected everyone else to have been too. He looked Ethan over, the way you'd look at a horse you weren't sure was worth the saddle price. "You Cade?" Cord said. "Yes, sir." "You worked cattle before?" 8 years. Before that, 2 seasons logging up in the Harrow Valley. Cord made a sound that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite the opposite. "You know what happened to the last 3 men we hired?" Ethan waited. First one lasted 9 days, said the work was too hard. Cord paused. The work wasn't too hard. He was too soft. He looked out toward the main house. Second one lasted 3 weeks. Left a note. Didn't even say goodbye in person, just left a note on the bunkhouse table and rode off before sunup. And the third? Still here, but he's not right in the head anymore. Cord said it so flatly that Ethan genuinely couldn't tell if he was joking. Point is, You want to work here, I need to know you're not the kind of man who spooks easy. I'm not, Ethan said. You say that now. I'll still say it in January. Something shifted very slightly in Cord's expression. Not a smile. The man didn't seem built for smiling, but something adjacent to respect. He stepped back from the gate and gestured toward the stable. Put your horse up. I'll show you the bunkhouse. Mr. Mercer will want to meet you before noon. What about Miss Mercer? Ethan asked. He'd heard the name in the town 3 miles east, at the general store where he'd stopped for supplies. The woman behind the counter had said the name Vivian Mercer the way you'd say the name of a winter storm, with a kind of tired familiarity and just enough caution to let you know it wasn't entirely safe. Cord stopped walking. He turned around slowly. Where'd you hear about Miss Mercer? Town. Woman at the store mentioned the ranch was hiring. Said something about the owner's daughter running things. Miss Mercer doesn't run things, Cord said carefully. She manages the operations. There's a difference. He said this like a man who had been corrected on this point before and had decided it was easier to just repeat the correction than explain it. And if you're smart, when you meet her, you'll speak when spoken to, do exactly what she asks without comment, and under no circumstances will you try to tell her how to do anything she's been doing her whole life. Ethan nodded slowly. That bad? Cord looked at him for a long moment. She's not bad, he said finally. She's seen a lot of men come through here who thought they knew better, and she made sure they understood they didn't. He turned and kept walking. She's almost always right, which makes it worse. Walter Mercer was 61 and looked it honestly. Not the kind of old that came from laziness, the kind that came from 50 years of working land that didn't give anything up without a fight. He had a white beard he kept trimmed close, hands that were more scar tissue than skin, and a quality about him that Ethan recognized immediately. The look of a man who had loved this place so long that it had become part of his actual body, like a second skeleton. They met in the ranch office, a room that smelled of wood smoke and old leather, and years of decisions made over maps spread across that oak desk. Walter shook his hand with the kind of grip that tells you everything you need to know about a man's history. Cord says you've got experience, Walter said. Yes, sir. Cord also says you didn't flinch when he told you about the other hands leaving. No, sir. Walter studied him across the desk. You got family? A son. 7 years old. Up north with my sister while I get established. Something moved in Walter's expression. Something knowing. Something that recognized the shape of that sentence, the weight underneath it. You planning on bringing him here eventually? That's the plan. Good, Walter said quietly, like the word meant more than just good, like it was shorthand for something longer. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment before looking back at Ethan. The ranch pays $40 a month plus room and board. Work starts before sunup. You'll answer to Cord for daily operations. He paused. And to my daughter for anything involving the cattle routes, the northern pasture, or the business end of things. Understood. She's going to be difficult, Walter said. Just like that. Plain. No warning, no softening. Not because she's a difficult person, because she's been let down by people who worked this land before, and she stopped giving the benefit of the doubt a long time ago. He looked directly at Ethan. I'm telling you this because I'm tired of watching men leave. I don't know if you're the kind of man who stays, but if you actually are, then this ranch needs you more than it's going to admit. Ethan held the old man's eyes. I'll stay as long as the work is honest. Walter nodded once, slowly. That's all I ask. He met Vivian Mercer at approximately 2 in the afternoon beside the water trough he had noticed from the ridge that morning. He had asked Cord where the tools were kept, found a pick and a bucket, and gone to break the ice himself without being told to. He was halfway through the second trough when he heard boots behind him on the frozen ground, and turned around to find a woman standing 12 feet away looking at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. She was 34, maybe 35. Dark hair pulled back without ceremony. She wore a heavy wool coat over work clothes that were actually worked in, not decorative, and she stood with the particular ease of someone who had been on this land their entire life and owned every inch of ground they were standing on. She was not soft. She was not fragile. She was sharp in the way a good tool is sharp, purposefully, usefully, with clear intent. She was also looking at him like he had done something wrong. Nobody asked you to do that, she said. Ethan glanced at the trough, then back at her. Cattle needed water. Trough was frozen. I know it was frozen. I was going to have Cord send someone after the morning feed. It's past noon. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Vivian Mercer took 2 steps closer and looked at him with a directness that most people, in his experience, reserved for arguments they'd already decided to win. You're the new hand. Ethan Cade. I know your name. I approved the hire. She looked at the trough, then back at him. Did Cord explain how things work here? He explained some of it. Then you know that I don't need men making decisions on this ranch without being asked to. Ethan held the pick loosely in both hands and met her eyes without aggression, without apology, without the particular social performance of deference that he knew some men used around women who had authority over them, the performance that was really just a quieter form of condescension. He just looked at her straight. The cattle were thirsty, he said. I fixed it. That's not a decision, Miss Mercer. That's just work. Something moved across her face. It happened fast, whatever it was, and she shut it down fast. She looked at him for another 3 seconds. Don't leave your tools in the yard when you're done, she said. Cord will show you where they're stored. She turned and walked back toward the main house. Ethan watched her go for a moment, then turned back to the trough and finished the job. The bunkhouse held 4 other men when Ethan arrived. He learned their names over the first 2 days the way you learn anything in a place like that. Not through formal introduction, but through proximity and shared labor. There was Pete Dalloway, 26, originally from Kansas, who talked more than any 3 normal people combined and somehow made it tolerable because most of what he said was accidentally funny. There was a quiet man named Hicks, who went by only his last name and who Ethan suspected had reasons for that, reasons it wasn't his business to ask about. There were 2 brothers named Garrett and Tom Sully, who had been working Black Hollow for 2 seasons, and who had achieved the particular ranch hand equilibrium of men who have stopped expecting anything to get better or worse and have simply decided to endure. You met her yet? Pete asked on the second night, sitting on his bunk cleaning mud off his boots with a stick. This afternoon, Ethan said. She run you off the property? No. Pete looked up. She say anything to you? Told me not to leave tools in the yard. Pete stared at him. Then he looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at Tom. Tom looked back at Pete, with an expression that suggested this was somehow significant. That's it? Pete said. That's all she said? More or less. Huh. Pete went back to his boot. Last guy she talked to on his first day, she told him his horse was tied wrong and that if he couldn't manage a simple hitch knot, she had questions about whether he could manage anything else on the property. He paused. He was gone by Thursday. Ethan lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Was the horse tied wrong? What? Was the knot wrong? Was she right? Pete opened his mouth, closed it. Well, yeah, actually, it was a pretty bad hitch. Then she was just telling him the truth. Sure, but the way she said it, I don't really care about the way, Ethan said. I care about whether she knows the work. Silence in the bunkhouse. Even Hicks looked up from whatever he was reading. She knows the work, Garrett said quietly from across the room. It was one of the first things he'd said all evening. He said it simply, without elaboration, with the absolute conviction of someone stating a law of physics. Better than anyone on this property, including Cord, maybe including her father. He went back to his book. Just so you know. Ethan filed that away. October passed into November the way a door closes, suddenly, and with finality. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a week. The ground that had still been soft under the surface hardened overnight into something closer to concrete, and the morning routines that had been merely difficult became punishing. Feed runs started at 4:30 in the dark. Fence checks became a daily emergency rather than a weekly chore. The cattle on the northern pasture grew restless in a way that Cord said meant bad weather coming, and Cord had been reading that particular signal long enough that everyone took it seriously. Ethan worked. That was the simplest way to say it, and it was the most accurate. He worked the way he had learned to work back when work was the only thing between him and a version of his life he refused to accept, with a kind of quiet, focused intensity that didn't perform itself, didn't ask for recognition, didn't stop to explain what it was doing or why. He just showed up before he was asked to and stayed after he was expected to leave. He fixed the leaning fence posts on the lower pasture the third day without being assigned to it. He found the water intake pipe on the eastern trough that was partially blocked and cleared it before it became a problem. He noticed that the hay storage in the main barn had a ventilation issue that was causing moisture buildup in the bottom bales, and he spent 2 evenings reorganizing the stacks and cutting a new vent gap in the upper boards. Nobody asked him to do any of it. Nobody told him not to either, Vivian noticed. He could tell she noticed, the way you can tell someone is watching you even when they're not looking directly at you. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't compliment the work or acknowledge it out loud. But on the 4th day, when she handed Cord the weekly task assignments, the list he gave Ethan had been quietly adjusted, less of the mindless grunt work that new hands usually spent their first months on, more of the actual operational tasks that required someone with judgment. It was a small thing, but in the language of Black Hollow Ranch, it was significant. The first real test came on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November. A section of fence on the western boundary had gone down in the night. Not from weather, not from where, but from a collision. One of the young steers had spooked at something, possibly a coyote, and hit the fence line at full speed, taking down 6 posts and about 40 feet of wire. By the time Ethan reached the site at first light, 3 cattle had wandered through the gap and were already moving northwest toward the Dunbar property line. He assessed the situation for about 15 seconds. Then he went and got his horse. He caught the 3 strays in under an hour, working the terrain the way he had learned to work it over 8 years. Patiently, with attention to where the animal's instincts wanted to take it, not fighting that instinct but redirecting it. When he got them back through the gap, he patched the fence with wire and spare posts from the tool shed, working fast enough in the freezing wind that his hands went partially numb by the time he hammered the last post home. He got back to the main yard at 9:15. Cord met him there. Standing beside Cord was Vivian. "Dunbar's man just rode over," Cord said. "Said he saw 3 of our cattle heading for his north pasture." "Already handled," Ethan said. "They're back in the west pen. Fence is patched, but the replacement posts need to be properly set. Ground's frozen, so I used what I could reach from the shed. I'd recommend pulling the whole section and resetting it properly when the thaw comes." Cord looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Ethan. "You went out there alone?" she said. "Yes." "Without telling anyone where you were going?" He paused. "That was fair. I should have told Cord. You're right. It won't happen again." Another one of those silences. She was looking at him with that same expression from the water trough, trying to find the angle, the performance, the tell that would explain him in a way that fit her existing understanding of ranch hands who overstepped. She couldn't find it. He could see her not finding it. "The posts on that section have been bad since August," she said finally. "I kept meaning to have the whole line replaced before winter." "I can do it," Ethan said, "when the ground breaks in spring." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she gave a short nod. Barely visible, like she'd decided to give him something small and wasn't sure yet if she'd regret it. "Fine," she said. "Cord will put it on your work list." She turned and walked away. Pete materialized at Ethan's shoulder approximately 3 seconds later. "She said fine," he whispered, like this was breaking news. "She literally said fine to you." "Go away, Pete. I've been here 8 months. She's never said fine to me once." Pete yelled. December arrived, and with it, the full weight of a Wyoming winter. Ethan had worked hard winters before, but there was something about the cold that came down through the Carver Mountains that was different from what he'd known farther north. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the pressure of it, the way it settled over the valley like something deliberate, like the land itself was testing you to see if you were serious about staying. He was serious. He called Margaret twice by telegraph from the town office, checking on Noah. The reports were good. The boy was healthy, doing well in school, had made a friend named Danny who apparently talked as much as Pete did, which Ethan found grimly funny. Margaret said Noah asked about him every few days, and Ethan told her to tell him he was working hard and would be home soon. Soon was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. He wrote the boy a letter, 2 pages long, describing the ranch and the mountains and the way the sky looked over the Carver Peaks at sunset, when the cold turned the whole horizon orange and red. He described Cord's face and how it looked like a cliff face someone had forgotten to finish. He described Pete and his endless talking and how even the silence between Pete's sentences somehow still contained noise. He did not describe Vivian Mercer because he wasn't sure how to describe her accurately without making her sound like either a villain or something else, and he wasn't ready to put either version on paper yet. He sealed the letter and sent it from town on a Thursday morning, and walking back to his horse in the frozen street, he passed the general store where the woman behind the counter, her name was Mrs. Hallett, he'd learned, was turning the sign on the door from closed to open. She saw him and came to the doorway. "You're the new man at Mercer's place," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him with the particular evaluative energy of a small-town woman who functions as an informal information clearinghouse. "How long are you planning to stay?" "Long as the work holds." She leaned against the doorframe. "Most men say something like that. Usually means they're gone by February." Ethan looked at her steadily. "Then I guess I'll see you in March, Mrs. Hallett." He mounted his horse and rode back toward the ranch. Behind him, he heard her laughing. A real laugh, surprised out of her. The argument happened on a Wednesday evening in the second week of December. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fight. It was the kind of argument that two people have when one of them knows they're right and the other one knows they're right, and neither of them is willing to step back far enough to see that they're both right about different things. The subject was the northern cattle route. Vivian had a plan, a proven plan, the same route they used every year, to manage the winter rotation, moving the northern herd in stages to prevent overgrazing on the lower pasture. It was a good plan. Ethan had studied the terrain enough by now to understand why it worked. He had also noticed something she might not have from the main yard. The secondary access path along the creek bend had accumulated an unusual amount of runoff ice over the past week, and if the temperature dropped another 5 degrees, moving cattle along that section at night, which the plan required, was going to be genuinely dangerous. He brought it up at the evening meeting Cord ran in the barn. "Route's fine," Vivian said immediately. "We've used it for 6 winters." "The ice on the bend is different this year," Ethan said. "It's built up faster. I walked it yesterday morning, and it's not just surface ice, it's layered. Cattle coming through in the dark are going to have trouble keeping their footing on that downslope." "Then we'll go slower." "Slower on ice in the dark with 100 head is still dangerous." She looked at him directly. Around them, the other men had achieved the specific kind of stillness that people achieve when they want to be invisible. "I know this route, Mr. Cade." "I know you do. I know it better than you." "Probably," he said. "Not a challenge, not a concession, just a fact. But I walked that bend yesterday and you didn't. I'm telling you what I saw." The silence lasted a little longer this time. Cord, to his credit or his survival instinct, said nothing. "I'll look at the bend myself tomorrow morning," Vivian said finally. Her voice was controlled, flat. "If I agree there's a problem, we'll adjust the route." "That's all I'm asking," Ethan said. She held his eyes for another moment. Then she turned to Cord and continued the meeting like the exchange hadn't happened. She walked the bend the next morning. She walked it alone, early, before anyone else was moving. When she came back, she told Cord to adjust the route. She said nothing to Ethan about it. She didn't have to. By Christmas, the ranch had developed a new equilibrium. Subtle, unspoken, but real. The other hands felt it. Cord felt it. Even Walter Mercer, who spent most of his days now in the warmth of the main house, reading or reviewing accounts with the particular contentment of a man who had worked hard his whole life and felt he'd finally earned the right to rest, felt it when he looked out the window in the mornings and watched the yard come to life. Ethan had become, without any formal declaration, the operational anchor of the property. Not because he had pushed for it, not because he had maneuvered or performed or made himself indispensable through calculation, simply because, day after day, he was the man who showed up with both the willingness and the judgment to handle what needed handling. And on a working ranch in a Wyoming winter, that combination is rarer than it sounds. What was harder to name, what nobody in the bunkhouse said out loud but everyone was aware of, was the shift in how Vivian moved through the property when Ethan was around. She was the same, still sharp, still direct, still fully capable of making a man feel like an idiot with 2 sentences if he'd earned it. That hadn't changed. But there was something different in the specific quality of her attention when she was in the same space as Ethan. A kind of focus that wasn't there with the other men. Not warmth. She wasn't soft with him, not even close, but a realness. Like she was actually present with him in a way she wasn't quite present with anyone else. Pete noticed it first because Pete noticed everything that could possibly be turned into something to talk about. He mentioned it to Garrett on a Tuesday night while they were playing cards. Garrett gave him a look that said, "I know, don't." Pete, to his considerable credit, let it go. The week before Christmas, a package arrived at the ranch from the Northern Territories. Ethan recognized Margaret's handwriting on the parcel. Inside was a letter from her, a small folded drawing from Noah, a horse and a man that were clearly supposed to be Ethan and his mare, rendered in the gloriously unrefined artistic style of a 7-year-old, and a single pressed wildflower, some summer thing that had no name Ethan knew, dried and flat and still faintly colored. He sat in the bunkhouse with the drawing in his hands for a long time that night. Pete, who had somehow understood for once that silence was what the room needed, said nothing. Ethan folded the drawing carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, against his chest, where he could feel it. He wrote Noah back that night, told him the drawing was the best horse he'd ever seen, told him the ranch was good work, hard work, the kind that made you sleep soundly, told him he was saving. "I'll be home soon," he wrote. "I promise." He stared at that line for a while. Then he left it. New Year's came quiet over Black Hollow. There was no celebration to speak of. A cold ranch in January doesn't have much energy left over for celebrating, and the men were tired in the particular full-body way that comes from 2 months of winter labor. Walter brought a bottle of whiskey to the bunkhouse on the evening of December 31st and poured 1 measure for each man, and they sat and drank it without much ceremony, and that was the holiday. Vivian appeared in the doorway of the bunkhouse briefly, just long enough for her father to see her and raise his glass. She raised hers. She'd brought her own. And then she looked once around the room, and for just a moment her eyes met Ethan's. And she gave a short, quiet nod that wasn't quite a toast and wasn't quite an acknowledgement of anything specific, but was something. Then she left. "Happy New Year, I guess," Pete said to no one in particular. "Go to sleep, Pete," said 3 voices simultaneously. What? January settled over the valley like something permanent. The work became brutal in the uncomplicated way of extreme cold. Not dangerous in the dramatic sense yet. Not the way February would be, but hard in the grinding, relentless way that wears a man down slowly. Fingers that wouldn't warm up, ground that wouldn't yield, equipment that froze and stuck and broke at the worst moments. Cattle that needed checking twice a day because the cold was working on them the same way it was working on the men. Ethan moved through it. He'd had a conversation with Walter one evening in early January, sitting in the ranch office while the old man reviewed the season's accounts. Walter had asked about Noah, and Ethan had told him more than he usually told people. About the boy, about what had happened with Noah's mother. Not much, just the shape of it, the way she'd left and what that had meant. About why he needed this season to count. Walter listened without the particular quality that some men bring to listening, where you can tell they're really just waiting to say something. He actually listened. "You're a good man, Ethan," he said when Ethan had finished. Ethan didn't know what to do with that, so he just nodded. "Vivian was 8 when her mother died," Walter said after a moment. He was looking at the account books, but not really seeing them. 11 years ago, she trusted someone she shouldn't have. A man who came through here thinking the ranch was worth more than the people on it. He paused. "She ran him off herself in the end. Didn't need my help. But it cost her something." He looked up at Ethan. "I'm telling you this not as a warning, just as information." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Why?" Walter studied him. "Because you're still here," he said simply. "And she knows you are." The second week of January brought a storm that tested the entire operation. 3 days of wind and snow that pushed visibility down to almost nothing and dropped the temperature to levels that made the air itself feel hostile. Animals needed to be moved, secured, fed in conditions where moving 50 feet across the yard required effort and attention. The creek froze solid. The north pasture became inaccessible. Ethan and Cord and the other men worked around the clock in shifts, and even Vivian was out in the yard for hours each day, directing movement, making decisions fast and correctly, her voice cutting through the wind with complete authority. On the second day of the storm, Ethan was moving a group of horses from the outer stable to the main barn when one of them panicked in the wind and pulled free, bolting toward the open gate that had been left unlatched in the chaos. He went after it. It took 20 minutes in whiteout conditions to locate and bring the horse back, and by the time he returned to the stable, Vivian was standing in the doorway, and she was not calm. "You disappeared," she said. Her voice was controlled but tight. "Horse got loose. I got it back." "You didn't tell anyone where you were going." "There wasn't time." "There's always time to say something." She stepped aside to let him bring the horse in, and he could see that she was angry in a way that wasn't quite about the horse, wasn't quite about the protocol. It was something underneath that. "Do not disappear on this property without telling someone where you're going," she said. "I don't care if there's not time. Make time." He tied the horse off and turned to look at her. In the low light of the stable, with the storm hammering the walls, her face was close to unreadable, but not completely. "Okay," he said. She blinked, like she'd been ready for an argument and the absence of one had thrown her slightly off balance. "Okay?" she repeated. "You're right. I'll make time." He held her eyes. "I won't disappear." Something crossed her face that she controlled immediately. But it had been there. Something real and unguarded, just for a second. "Good," she said, and went back out into the storm. And February came in cold and clear and absolutely merciless. The work had not broken Ethan Cade. The cold had not broken him. The loneliness, the long nights, the weight of Noah's face in his mind, none of it had broken him. Black Hollow Ranch had not broken him. But standing in the yard on the first morning of February, watching the Carver Mountains hold the sunrise at their peaks like they were deciding whether to give it to the valley below, he felt something that wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite restlessness, but lived somewhere between them. He felt like he had been here before. Not this place. This particular arrangement of land and cold and hard work and complicated people. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, which was a feeling he hadn't trusted in a very long time. It scared him, a little. He went back to work. The storm that had hammered Black Hollow through the first week of February finally broke on a Sunday, leaving the valley buried under 2 feet of snow that sparkled hard and indifferent in the returning sunlight. The world outside looked clean. It wasn't. Clean was just what things looked like when the damage was hidden underneath. Ethan knew that particular kind of deception well. The days after the storm were consumed by damage assessment and repair. Sections of the north fence had gone down under the weight of accumulated ice. A portion of the cattle shelter roof had partially collapsed, and 3 of the younger steers had developed coughs that Cord monitored with the quiet worry of a man trying not to show he was worried. The ranch absorbed the aftermath the way it absorbed everything, with labor, without complaint, without the luxury of stopping to feel bad about it. Ethan worked alongside Cord on the fence line Monday and Tuesday, and alongside Pete and the Sully brothers on the shelter roof Wednesday, and by Thursday his hands had a new collection of cuts and abrasions that he barely noticed anymore. The cold was a fact of life now, not a surprise. His body had stopped fighting it and started just enduring it, which he knew from experience was both an adaptation and a warning sign. Vivian worked through all of it too. He watched her, not in a way that followed her, not deliberately, just in the way you become aware of how a space moves when you've been in it long enough. She directed the shelter repair from below, refusing to let anyone climb the damaged section until she'd assessed the structural integrity herself, which she did by climbing it herself first while everyone on the ground went quiet. She called out measurements and weak points in the same tone she used for everything. Direct, spare, exactly as many words as necessary, and not one more. Nobody argued with her. Nobody had a reason to. That evening, Ethan found himself in the main barn doing a final check on the horses before supper, and Vivian came in while he was finishing the last stall. She had a lantern and a clipboard with the week's accounts on it, and she stopped when she saw him, briefly, the way you stop when you walk into a room expecting to be alone. "I'll be done in a minute," Ethan said. "Take your time." She moved to the far side of the barn, set her lantern on a post, and began working through the clipboard. He could hear the scratch of her pencil in the quiet. They didn't talk for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. It was the kind of silence that 2 people share when they've been working the same hard days in the same hard cold, and both of them are too tired to perform anything. "Roof's gonna need a full replacement come spring," Ethan said eventually. not really starting a conversation, just saying a true thing. I know, she said. I've been putting it off. The east wall, too. The ice got under the boards. She made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been resignation. With her, the difference was sometimes difficult to detect. I have a list, she said. It keeps getting longer. He looked over at her. She was still looking at the clipboard, pencil moving. The lantern light was warm and specific in the cold of the barn. Every working ranch has a list like that, he said. This one has a longer one than most. She paused. My father let some of the maintenance go the last couple of years. He didn't have the energy, and I couldn't be in two places at once. She said it without self-pity, just factually. Things piled up. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that particular architecture of deferred problems, the way small neglects accumulate quietly until suddenly you're looking at a situation that requires everything you have just to stabilize. He'd lived in that architecture himself, in other areas of his life. He didn't say any of that. He just said, "We'll get through the list." She looked up from the clipboard then. She looked at him with an expression that was fractionally less armored than her usual, like the fatigue of the week had worn through a layer of it. Not vulnerable, not soft, just present, real. You keep saying we, she said. I work here. A lot of men have worked here. I know. She held his eyes for a moment and then she went back to the clipboard. Good night, Mr. Cade, she said. Good night, Miss Mercer. He finished with the last stall and walked out into the frozen dark, and the cold hit him clean across the face, and he stood there for a moment breathing it in before heading to the bunkhouse. He didn't think too hard about the look on her face or what it meant. He'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to ruin something fragile was to look at it too directly before it was ready to be seen. The second week of February brought a different kind of pressure. Not weather, but people. The Dunbar operation sat 3 miles to the northwest of Black Hollow, and its owner, a thick-necked landowner named Curtis Dunbar, had been watching the Mercer property with a particular quality of attention for the better part of 2 years. Ethan had learned this from Cord, who had the rancher's habit of explaining things in understatement, so heavy it functioned like the opposite. When Cord said Dunbar keeps an eye on the northern boundary, what he actually meant was that Dunbar had been systematically testing that boundary for 18 months, letting his cattle drift onto Mercer land during grazing season, sending his hands to check fence lines that weren't his fence lines, and making carefully worded offers to Walter about the northern grazing fields that were technically proposals and functionally threats. Walter had declined all of them, but Walter wasn't as strong as he used to be, and Dunbar knew it. He came by last Thursday, Cord told Ethan one morning over coffee in the barn. The way Cord told you anything important, while doing something else, not looking at you directly, like the information was incidental. While you and the boys were working the shelter roof, talked to Walter for about an hour. What did Walter say? Walter said no, same as always. Cord was quiet for a moment. But this time Dunbar brought a number with him, a real number, enough that Walter had to think about it for a second before he said no. Ethan looked at his coffee. What's Vivian think? Vivian doesn't know yet. Cord finally looked at him. Walter didn't tell her. That sat in the air between them. He's protecting her from it, Ethan said. He's protecting himself from her reaction to it, Cord corrected, with the very slight sardonic edge of a man who has watched this family for decades and has earned the right to small truths, which is understandable, but it's not going to hold. She'll find out. When she does, yeah, Cord said, that was all. Yeah, she found out 2 days later. Ethan didn't know exactly how. Probably the same way information moved through any small operation. Through proximity, through overheard words, through the specific silences that fall around topics people are deliberately not discussing. However it happened, she came into the barn on a Saturday afternoon where Ethan was working on the tack, and the quality of her presence in the room told him immediately that something had changed. She stood near the entrance for a moment. She was holding herself differently. There was a tension across her shoulders that he'd learned to read over the weeks. Not anger exactly, but the thing that anger comes from, something underneath it. Did you know? She said. He knew immediately what she meant. Cord told me a few days ago. And you didn't say anything to me. It wasn't mine to say. That landed somewhere in her. He could see it. She wasn't sure whether to be angry at him for the omission or not, and the uncertainty itself seemed to frustrate her more than either clean answer would have. Dunbar has been circling this place for 2 years, she said. Her voice was controlled. It was the kind of control that takes real effort. Every time I think I've made it clear that this land is not for sale, he finds another angle. What are you going to do? What I always do. She moved further into the barn and he could see her working through something internally, working through the shape of the problem the way she worked through any problem on the property, systematically, looking for the weak points. He's counting on my father's health. He thinks if he's patient enough, Walter will run out of the energy to keep saying no. She stopped near the post where his tack was hanging and looked at it without seeing it. He might be right. It was a rare thing to hear from her, that kind of open admission of the actual shape of a fear. Not dressed up, not minimized, just said. Your father's not going anywhere yet, Ethan said. He's 61 and his heart isn't what it was. She said it quietly, not dramatically. Just the weight of a fact she carried all the time, every day, without putting it down. I've been running this operation for 3 years already. He signs the papers, but the work is... She stopped herself. The work is yours, Ethan said. She looked at him, then she looked away. I shouldn't have said that. Why not? It's true. It makes me sound like I'm... She shook her head. It doesn't matter. Like you're what? He said. Not pressing, just leaving the door open. The barn was quiet around them. Outside, the wind was moving again, low and persistent, the way it moved in Wyoming in February, like it had nowhere specific to be but wasn't planning on leaving either. Like I'm waiting for him to die so I can have what's already mine, she said. The words came out harder than she'd intended, and she heard it, and something crossed her face that was close to pain. Which I'm not. I would give every inch of this land if it meant keeping him healthy. She paused. But I'm so tired of fighting for something that should already be decided. Ethan set down the piece of tack he'd been working on. It is decided, he said. The land is yours. Dunbar's offers don't change that. His money might. Not if you don't let it. She looked at him with an edge of irritation. That's easy to say when it's not your name on the deed. You're right, he said simply. It is. The irritation didn't quite leave her face, but it changed shape, became something more complicated, something that wasn't just frustration at him, but frustration at the whole arrangement of things, the whole weight of it. I've been managing this ranch since I was 23, she said. I know every acre, every fence line, every drainage problem, every feed schedule, every supply route. I know what it needs in every season. I know it better than anyone alive. She looked at him directly. And I have spent 11 years watching men come through that gate assuming that a woman who knows all of that still needs someone to come along and either take it from her or save it for her. Ethan held her gaze. He didn't say anything for a moment. I'm not here to save anything, he said. I'm here to work. Everyone says something like that? Then I'll let the work say it. She studied him for another long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the barn entrance, and he thought the conversation was done. She stopped in the doorway, her back to him. Dunbar's going to make another offer, she said. To my father, soon. I think he's planning something. She paused. I need to know if anything changes on the north boundary. His men, his cattle, anything that doesn't belong there. I'll watch it, Ethan said. She left without responding, but he understood by now that that meant yes. The thing about Vivian Mercer that took Ethan the longest to understand wasn't her hardness. Her hardness was visible, available, easy to map. It was consistent and explicable, and in most respects completely reasonable given what Cord and Walter had told him, given what he could piece together from 11 years of consequences still living in the way she held herself and spoke to people and kept every interaction on this ranch at a specific controlled distance. The thing that took longer to understand was the precision of her loneliness. Not the fact of it. Anyone paying attention could see the fact of it. But the specific shape, the way she had built a life that was full of purpose and work and legitimate competence and the respect of people who knew better than to underestimate her, and had built all of it in a way that made closeness structurally impossible. Like she'd looked at what closeness cost and decided the work was safer. The land was safer. The cattle and the fence lines and the account books and the seasonal rhythms of a working ranch were all safer because none of them would make promises they couldn't keep, and none of them would leave a note on a table and be gone by sunrise. He understood that logic. He'd lived a version of it himself. He just knew from experience that understanding the logic of a wall you've built doesn't stop it from being a prison. He wasn't thinking about breaking through anything. He wasn't thinking about her that way, or rather, he was trying not to, with the moderate success of a man who keeps telling himself he's not looking at something while looking at it. What he was thinking, when he let himself think it, was that Vivian Mercer was one of the most capable people he'd ever known, and one of the loneliest. And those two things were not a coincidence. And that somehow, over the past weeks on this ranch, he'd become the only person she seemed willing to say true things to, even just occasionally, even just in barns with bad light and the wind going outside. He was trying not to read too much into that. He was not entirely succeeding. Cord found a man from Dunbar's operation on the north boundary on a Wednesday morning in the third week of February. Not on Mercer land technically, but close enough to the fence line to be deliberate, close enough to be a message. The man said he was just checking on some strays. There were no Dunbar cattle anywhere in the area. It was a lie that wasn't even trying to be convincing. Cord sent him back without incident. He told Vivian that evening at dinner, which Ethan knew because Pete had overheard it through the window of the main house, because Pete was Pete. "What's Dunbar doing?" Pete asked Ethan that night in the bunkhouse, the question carrying genuine anxiety beneath the idle tone. "Pressure," Ethan said. "He's applying pressure to see what moves." "What does that mean for us?" Ethan looked at the ceiling. "It means we don't move." 3 nights later, the pressure took a different form. A man rode to the ranch on a Thursday evening, not from Dunbar's operation, but connected to it. Ethan recognized the horse from the North Boundary incident and asked to speak with Ethan specifically, not Cord, not Walter. Ethan. He found the man waiting by the outer gate in the last light of the day. He was well dressed for the territory, which told you something, and he had the particular quality of a man paid to deliver messages that the person who hired him didn't want to deliver personally. "Mr. Cade," the man said, "my employer is prepared to offer you a significant sum to seek employment elsewhere." Ethan looked at him. "How significant?" The man told him the number. It was objectively a lot of money, more than a season at Black Hollow, more than 2 seasons. Enough to go north right now, enough to get Noah, enough to start over somewhere warmer and less brutal with a cushion that would take years to build otherwise. He thought about that for approximately 4 seconds. "No," Ethan said. The man blinked. He'd probably expected negotiation. "Mr. Cade, if you'd consider—" "I said no." Ethan's voice was level. "Tell your employer the answer is no today, and it'll be no tomorrow, and it'll be no in March. And tell him that if he sends anyone else onto this property without invitation, I'll be the one who meets them at the gate, and it won't be a polite conversation." The man looked at him for a moment. Something in Ethan's face apparently communicated that this was not a performance. "I'll relay the message," the man said. He turned his horse and rode back toward the north. Ethan stood at the gate until the sound of the horse faded. He didn't tell Vivian that night. He told Cord in the morning, and Cord told him he'd done the right thing, and Cord's expression as he said it had a quality Ethan couldn't quite name, something like relief mixed with something older and more complicated. "She'll find out," Cord said. "I know. She's going to want to know why you turned it down." Ethan picked up his tools for the morning. "I turned it down because it was the right call." Cord looked at him steadily. "That's not the only reason." Ethan didn't answer that. He walked out to the fence line instead, into the cold and the flat white morning, and went to work. Vivian found out about the offer 2 days later. He didn't know who told her. Maybe Cord, maybe one of the hands who'd seen the rider at the gate. It didn't matter. She found him at the water trough, the same trough where they'd first spoken back in October, which struck him as the kind of coincidence that didn't mean anything, but that you notice anyway. She stood where she'd stood that first day, and for a moment the symmetry of it was almost funny. She wasn't angry. That surprised him. He'd expected some version of anger. Not at him, but at Dunbar, at the situation, at being the last to know again. Instead, she looked at him with something quieter than anger. "You turned it down," she said. "Yes." "It was a real number." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the yard and moved a strand of her hair, and she didn't fix it. "Why?" He looked at her directly. He thought about giving her a practical answer, about work, about commitment, about the principle of not being bought off. All of those things were true. He said the more honest version, because I'm not done here yet. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he became aware of his own pulse in a way that was somewhat inconvenient. Her expression moved through something he couldn't fully read, several things passing across it in sequence, each one controlled before the next one arrived. "All right," she said finally. She turned and walked back toward the house. Halfway across the yard, she stopped, and without turning around, she said, "Thank you." Then she kept walking. Ethan turned back to the trough. His hands were not entirely steady, which he found mildly aggravating. The last week of February brought another storm, smaller than the February opener, but sharp and mean in the way of late winter storms that arrive after you've started to hope they might be done. Ice followed the snow. The yard was treacherous by morning of the third day. A delivery wagon from town slid off the access road a mile from the gate, and Ethan and Garrett spent most of the afternoon pulling it clear with the draft horses. Coming back in the early dark, passing the main house, Ethan saw the light in Walter's window and the shadow moving in it, and further along the porch, another figure. Vivian, standing at the far end with her arms crossed against the cold, looking north toward the mountains that were invisible now in the dark and the weather. He almost kept walking. He was cold and tired, and there was nothing to say that would make either of those things different, but he stopped at the porch steps. She heard him and turned slightly. "Long day," he said, which was inadequate but true. "Every day is a long day in February," she said. He stood there for a moment, cold air between them, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The ranch was quiet around them in the specific way it got quiet when everyone had finally gone inside and the animals had settled and the wind had dropped to something bearable. "You doing all right?" he asked. Simple question. He wasn't sure why he asked it. It wasn't the kind of thing they said to each other. She looked at him. For a moment he thought she was going to deflect, to give him the standard Vivian Mercer answer, the one that meant "I'm fine and this conversation is unnecessary." He was already preparing to accept it and go inside. Instead, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Some days are harder than others." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. He understood that kind of sentence, the kind that sounds small, but contains something much larger that isn't ready to come out yet, if it ever will. "Yeah," he said. They stood there for another moment, two people in the cold on a porch at the end of a hard day, on a hard ranch in the middle of a hard winter. And then Ethan said goodnight and walked to the bunkhouse, and the light in the main house stayed on for a long time after. He lay awake that night longer than he should have. He wasn't ready to name what he was feeling. He wasn't sure it was useful to name it. What he knew was that something in the arrangement of his life over the past 4 months had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure what to do with. And the honest part of him, the part that got honest at 2 a.m. when the cold was outside and Noah's drawing was folded against his chest and the bunkhouse was silent around him, knew that he hadn't turned down Dunbar's money only because it was the right call. He also knew Vivian Mercer well enough by now to understand that whatever was shifting on both sides, and that it scared her in a way that very little else on this earth did. The land, the work, the weather, Dunbar's threats. She knew how to fight all of those. She had tools for all of those. She didn't have tools for this. And neither, if he was being honest with himself, did he. Outside, the last of the February storm moved through the valley and took the ice with it, and somewhere in the Carver Mountains, the first water was beginning to run under the surface of the snowpack, invisible and quiet, finding its way through stone the same way it always had, not by force, just by persistence, just by being exactly what it was and not stopping. March arrived like a false promise. The first week brought 3 days of actual warmth, relative warmth, the kind that makes 40 degrees feel generous after months of temperatures that had no business existing. And the snow on the lower pastures began to pull back from the fence lines, and the cattle moved differently, with less of the hunched, enduring quality they'd carried all winter. The yard turned to mud. The creek started talking again under the remaining ice. Pete Dalloway declared spring was coming with the confidence of a man who had been wrong about this before and hadn't learned from it. He was wrong about it again. The temperature dropped back on the 4th day, hard and fast, and the meltwater that had pooled in the low sections of the north pasture froze overnight into something worse than the original snow. Thin, invisible sheets of ice hiding under a fresh dusting of powder that fell Thursday night like the land was covering its tracks. The kind of surface that looked passable and wasn't. The kind that waited. Ethan noticed it on the Friday morning check and marked 3 sections of the north route as compromised in his head, filed it away the way he filed everything about the property now, with the automatic attention of someone who had stopped being a temporary presence and started being a permanent one, whether or not that word had been spoken out loud by anyone. The shift had happened gradually enough that he almost hadn't registered it. At some point over the winter, he had stopped thinking about Black Hollow Ranch as a place he was staying and started thinking about it as a place he lived. There was a difference, and it mattered. You worked differently when it was yours. Not owned, not on paper, but in the muscle memory, in the way your eye moved across the land in the morning, looking for what needed attention. He had that now. He couldn't remember exactly when it had started. He thought about Noah more as the weather softened, even slightly. The saved money was growing. A few more months and it would be enough. Not comfortable, not a cushion exactly, but enough to go north and come back with his son and start the actual life he'd been building toward. He'd written the boy twice in March already. Noah had written back once, 4 sentences in the careful block printing of a child still working out the relationship between thought and hand, and the letter said, "I drew you another horse. This one is better. Danny says hi." "When are you coming?" Ethan had read that last sentence 6 times. When are you coming? Not when are you coming home. Just when are you coming? Which meant wherever Ethan was, that was where home pointed. The simplicity of it had done something to his chest that he hadn't been prepared for. Soon, he'd written back. "I promise." He kept saying that. He had to start making it mean something concrete. What made the math complicated, and he was honest enough with himself to admit it was complicated, was that the calculation now involved more than money. It involved a ranch he'd bled into over 4 months and a set of people he'd stopped being a stranger to. And it involved a woman who had said thank you to him from across a yard, and some days are harder than others. From a dark porch. And those 2 sentences had lodged somewhere in him like splinters he kept finding when he moved in certain directions. He was not making good progress at not thinking about Vivian Mercer. She had not made it easier by becoming, incrementally and apparently without intending to, someone different with him than she was with everyone else. Not softer. He wanted to be precise about that, because soft was the wrong word, and she would have hated it. But real. In the specific way that most people weren't real with anyone. Like with him, she had stopped spending the energy on the performance of competence and control that she maintained with every other person on the property, because somewhere along the line she'd apparently accepted that he already knew she was competent, and she didn't need to perform it for him. That acceptance, unspoken, ungiven as any formal thing, was the most intimate thing she'd offered anyone in years. He understood that without being told. He also understood that it cost her something to give it, and that she was not fully at peace with the cost. They worked well together now, him and Vivian. Better than well. There was an efficiency to it that had stopped feeling like coordination between an employer and a hand, and started feeling like something that had its own grammar. She'd started occasionally asking his opinion on operational decisions before making them. Not because she needed validation, but because she'd concluded his read on certain situations was worth having. He'd started anticipating her priorities without being asked, not because he was performing dutiful service, but because he'd paid enough attention to understand what this land needed and what she needed from it. And those things had become, for him, the same project. Cord watched all of this with the expression of a man who was keeping a very careful count of something. Walter watched it with something warmer. Something that looked almost like quiet satisfaction. He'd taken to sitting on the porch in the afternoons when the weather allowed, and occasionally Ethan would pass by and the old man would call him over and they'd talk about nothing specific. The cattle, the repairs, the spring work coming, the territory in general. Walter never said anything direct, but sometimes he'd look at Ethan with a quality in his eyes that felt like a man checking to see if something he'd hoped for was actually happening. Ethan never asked about it. He respected the old man too much to make it awkward. The Friday that changed everything started out ordinary. Vivian left before anyone else was up, which was not in itself unusual. She rode the north boundary alone most weeks, doing her own check independent of what the hands reported, because that was how she'd always done it, and she saw no reason to change it. The difference this particular Friday was the weather. The temperature had dropped back to single digits overnight, and the fresh powder that had fallen Thursday had covered exactly the kind of refrozen melt ice that Ethan had mentally flagged but hadn't yet formally reported to anyone. He came out of the bunkhouse at 5:40 and saw that her horse was gone from the stable and felt something tighten in him, quick and specific. He told himself it was nothing. She'd ridden the north boundary 100 times. He went through the morning routine with half his attention somewhere else. By 7:30, when she hadn't returned and the sky to the north had gone the color of old iron and the wind was picking up again from the northwest, the tightness in him had become something louder. "She rides the full boundary loop. How long does that take?" he asked Cord, trying to keep the question casual. Cord looked at him with the expression of a man who knew the question wasn't casual. 2 hours easy, more if she stops at the ridge overlook. "She takes the creek bend section?" Cord went still for a fraction of a second. He understood immediately. He knew the ice was bad there. Ethan had mentioned it in passing 2 days ago. He hadn't flagged it officially, hadn't told Vivian specifically, because it was one of a dozen items on a running mental list. And she was Vivian, and she'd ridden that route her whole life, and he'd assumed, and that was his mistake. "Which route does she take to the ridge?" Ethan asked. "North track past the second water break. Goes along the upper creek drainage." Cord's jaw tightened. "That section has the downslope she cuts across to hit the overlook." The downslope. The one Ethan had walked 3 days ago. The one with the layered ice that you couldn't see under powder. He was at the stable in less than 2 minutes. Cord called something after him. He didn't stop to hear what it was. His mare, Sable, had picked up on his urgency the way horses do. She was already moving before he had the saddle fully settled, rolling her weight forward against the cinch, ears up, reading him. He took 30 seconds to do the job right, because a loose saddle on that terrain was its own catastrophe. And then he was moving north at a pace that the conditions only barely justified, and that he chose anyway. The land opened up past the main gate into the north pasture, and the fresh powder over the fields looked undisturbed except for the single trail of hoofprints heading northeast. Vivian's horse, the prints clean and distinct in the early morning stillness. He followed them. The temperature hit him like a wall as he moved away from the shelter of the main buildings. That particular open field cold that doesn't care about your coat, and the iron-colored sky pressed lower and the wind picked up, and somewhere to the northwest there was the quality in the atmosphere that meant more weather was building. Not today, maybe, but close. He followed the trail at a pace that was too fast for comfortable, and not fast enough for what he was feeling in his chest. The track curved northeast toward the second water break, then north along the creek drainage, exactly the way Cord had described. The hoofprints were still clean, still single file, still the careful, deliberate stride of a horse being well managed, up to the point where the drainage curved toward the ridge. There, the stride pattern changed. He saw it from 30 yards out and felt his stomach drop. The prints became irregular, the spacing wrong, the depth varying in a way that meant the horse had been managing uncertain footing. And then, 70 feet further up the slope, where the downgrade began in earnest, the pattern stopped being a trail at all. It became a disruption. Churned snow, multiple overlapping impacts, the long ugly gouge of something sliding sideways, and then a gap. And then below the gap, down the slope, the evidence of something that had come down hard and fast. He put Sable into a controlled descent down the slope, picking the edge rather than the center where the disruption was, and came around the base of the ridge where the ravine opened up and found them. The horse first, Vivian's roan standing 30 feet from the ravine's edge, with his reins caught on a deadfall branch, one leg slightly favored but upright, breathing hard. Then Vivian, 15 feet from the horse, sitting in the snow with her back against the ravine wall, and one leg extended at an angle that told him immediately what had happened. Her hat was gone. There was blood on her temple. Not a lot, but visible against the cold whitened skin of her face. She was conscious. She was looking at him with an expression that he couldn't immediately name. He dropped from Sable and crossed the snow to her in 8 steps. "Don't," she said as he crouched in front of her. "Don't what?" "Don't make it. Just give me a second." He gave her a second. He used it to look at her, the leg, the head, the color of her face, the steadiness of her breathing. She was in pain. She was managing the pain the way she managed everything, through the force of her own controlled attention, keeping herself oriented and functional through sheer will. It was, under the circumstances, both impressive and irritating. "Can you move the ankle?" he said. She tried. The sound she made was very short and very quiet, the smallest possible concession to pain, but it was enough. "Okay," he said. "Don't." "It's probably just sprained," she said. "The way you reacted to moving it, it might be cracked." He looked at her temple. "How's your head?" "I hit the wall when the horse went down. I'm clear. I'm not dizzy." She paused. I didn't see the ice." "I know," he said. "That's on me. I should have told you about that section." She looked at him. "You knew?" "I walked it 3 days ago. I should have flagged it formally." He held her eyes. "I'm sorry." Something moved across her face. She hadn't expected that. The direct, unhedged apology. No explanation, no minimizing, just the acknowledgement, clean and straight. "I should have checked it myself," she said finally. "Yeah, well." He looked up at the sky. The iron color was spreading. "We can split that later. Right now I need to get you back. I can ride—" "Not on that ankle? Not on that horse?" The roan was still favoring his right foreleg. Even if Vivian's ankle had been fine, which it was not, putting her on that horse over this terrain in building weather was not happening. "We're going double on Sable. She can carry it." Vivian opened her mouth. He saw the refusal forming, the instinctive rejection of needing to be carried, literally, by anyone on this earth. He saw her look at her ankle. He saw her look at the sky. "The roan," she started. "He can walk. I'll lead him." He shifted forward. "This is going to hurt." "I know. Tell me if it's too much." "It won't be too much." "Vivian, it won't be." He believed her, partly. He picked her up anyway because there was no alternative, got one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, and stood up in one movement, and she made that same small sound again, tight and controlled, and her hand gripped his coat with a force that told him everything about how much it actually hurt, even if she was never going to say it. He got her up onto Sable, in front of the saddle, and mounted behind her and reached around to take the reins. She was rigid against him for the first moment, every muscle in her carrying the tension of a person not accustomed to depending on anyone for anything, not accustomed to being this close, this held, this without recourse to her own self-sufficiency. He didn't say anything about it. He just started moving, walking Sable carefully down the slope and around to flatter terrain, keeping the pace slow and deliberate, one hand on the reins and the other steadying her when the footing shifted under them. He had the roan's lead rope looped over his saddle horn. The wind was picking up properly now, cold and direct from the northwest, and the sky had gone darker in the last 20 minutes. They had 6 miles back to the ranch. A mile in, she stopped being rigid. It happened slowly, not a decision, just an exhaustion of the effort it took to hold herself separate when she was cold and hurt, and the horse's movement was making her ankle fire with every step, and Ethan was right there, solid and present, not saying anything stupid or trying to make it into something. She leaned back against him slightly, just slightly, enough that he could feel the change in weight and pressure, and he adjusted his seat on the saddle without comment, gave her more to rest against. Neither of them said anything about it. The miles moved under them. The wind found every gap in Ethan's coat and made itself known. He kept his eyes on the terrain ahead, reading it, routing around the sections he knew were bad, keeping Sable to the deer trails where the ground was more predictable. He was cold enough that his hands had gone past the sharper cold into the duller kind, the kind where you have to remind yourself to keep the grip firm because you can't entirely feel it. He thought about what Walter had said. "I don't know if you're the kind of man who stays." He thought about Dunbar's number and the 4 seconds it had taken him to say no. He thought about Noah's letter and "When are you coming?" and the drawing in his coat pocket. He thought about the particular way Vivian had said some days are harder than others on that dark porch, the way she'd offered it like something small when it was something much bigger. He thought, with a clarity that comes sometimes from cold and physical effort and the specific stripped-back reality of hard situations, that he was holding the most complicated woman he'd ever known in his arms on a half-frozen ridge in Wyoming, and that he did not want to be anywhere else. That thought was terrifying, practically speaking. He filed it for later because the ranch was still 4 miles away and the weather was still building, and right now the only thing that mattered was getting her home. 2 miles from the ranch, it started snowing. Not blizzard conditions, not yet, but steady and thickening, cutting visibility and adding another layer of cold that the wind was already carrying. Sable moved without complaint, sure-footed and patient, and Ethan talked to her quietly every few minutes the way you talk to a horse you trust, and she answered with her ears and her pace and the steady rhythm of her breathing. Vivian said from somewhere against his shoulder, "You talk to your horse. She likes it." "What do you tell her?" "Right now I'm telling her she's doing well and the barn's close and there's extra feed waiting." He paused. "She believes me because I've never lied to her." A silence. Then quietly, "Does that work on people too?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't tried it on anyone who didn't want to believe me in the first place." She didn't respond to that, but he felt something change in the way she was breathing. Something that might have been a quiet exhale. Something that might have meant more than just cold air. The ranch came into view through the snow at a distance. The main house first, yellow light in the windows, then the barn outline, then the bunkhouse, all of it small and specific against the white. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest at the sight of it. He was not the only one. He felt Vivian breathe differently when the buildings appeared, not quite relief, but the particular physical response of a body that has been running on adrenaline and stubbornness and pain management for 2 hours, finally receiving the information that it's almost over. "Almost there," he said. "I see it," she said. They came through the gate at the main yard and Pete saw them first. Pete always saw things first, which was the functional compensation for his inability to process what he saw quietly. He shouted something that brought Cord out of the barn at a run, and then Walter appeared in the doorway of the main house, and all of it converged in the yard at once. Cord reached them first. He took Sable's bridle. He looked at Vivian and then at Ethan, and his face carried something that was equal parts relief and the controlled suppression of everything he was probably thinking about the ice on that ridge section and whose job it had been to flag it. "What happened?" Cord said, flat, not quite a question. "The downslope on the north ridge," Ethan said. "Ice under the powder. Horse went down. She's got the ankle and took a hit to the head." Cord nodded once, sharp. "Doc's in town. I'll ride for him." "Get me down first," Vivian said. Her voice was still controlled, still exactly herself, except for a thinness in it now, a fatigue that had been there since the ravine and that she'd been holding back by force for 6 miles. "Stop talking about me like I'm cargo." "Yes, ma'am," Cord said without inflection. Ethan dismounted and lifted her down. She held his coat again with that same white-knuckled grip that she would never acknowledge as needing anything, and he carried her to the porch steps where Walter was already there, and the old man's face was doing several things at once that he was not going to be able to hold together much longer. "Vivian," Walter said, and the word came out rougher than he'd intended, rougher than he probably wanted. "I'm fine, Papa," she said. The word, Papa, landed in the yard like something rare. He'd never heard her use it before. Maybe she only used it when she was hurt. "You're not fine," Walter said. "I'm functional," she said, which was so precisely her that even under the circumstances, something almost like a smile tried to form on Ethan's face before he controlled it. He got her inside, into the warmth, onto the settle, in the front room where Walter covered her with a blanket and started building the fire back up, and Cord went for the doctor, and Pete hovered in the doorway with the expression of a man who desperately wanted to be useful and couldn't identify a way to be useful. "Pete," Ethan said. "Yeah." "Go take care of the roan. Check his right foreleg." Pete disappeared, grateful for the assignment. Ethan stayed long enough to make sure she was settled, which she was, in the way of a person who is in real pain and finally in a place where they can let their body acknowledge it without the whole operation falling apart because of it. He brought her water. She took it without comment. Walter walked him to the door a few minutes later, and outside on the porch the old man stood in the cold for a moment without speaking. The snow was still coming down. The yard was quiet. "Thank you," Walter said. His voice was careful around it, the way it was careful around anything that mattered too much. "For going after her." "She'd have been all right a while longer," Ethan said, which was true enough to be honest and not true enough to be comforting. "But the weather was turning." Walter nodded. He looked out at the snow. "She's been riding that boundary alone since she was 19, he said. "I used to worry about it. Then I stopped worrying, and then I started again." He was quiet a moment. I think I started again around the time you arrived, actually. Ethan looked at him. Not because I thought it was more dangerous, Walter said, because I started thinking about what it would mean if something happened to her. Who would... He stopped, started again differently. It matters differently now, is what I'm saying. Ethan held the old man's eyes for a moment. He didn't have a clean answer for that, so he just nodded. He walked back to the bunkhouse through the snow. He was so cold by then that it took 20 minutes by the stove to bring full feeling back to his hands, and he sat there for a long time after the others had gone to sleep, staring at the fire. He kept thinking about that single moment on Sable, 2 miles from home, when she'd stopped holding herself separate and leaned back against him. Small thing. She hadn't meant it as anything. She'd been hurt and tired and cold, and the body just does what the body does when it has used up its reserves. But he knew the truth of it, which was that Vivian Mercer didn't lean on people. Not the people she'd known her whole life. Not Cord, who'd been here since she was a child. Not her father, whom she loved more than the land itself. She had leaned on him. He sat with that by the fire for a long time, not deciding anything, not naming anything, just holding it the way you hold something that isn't fully yours yet, but that you already know you'd burn down a lot of things to keep safe. Outside, the snow fell over Black Hollow Ranch without hurry, covering the yard and the fence lines and the fields beyond, and somewhere in the main house a lamp was still burning. The doctor came from town that same evening, a thin, careful man named Hale, who had been treating the valley's injuries and illnesses for 20 years and had the particular unhurried efficiency of someone who had seen everything at least twice. He examined Vivian's ankle in the front room while Walter hovered in the doorway, and Ethan waited on the porch with the cold against his back, listening to the low exchange of voices through the wall without being able to make out the words. Cord appeared beside him after a while. They stood there together, not saying anything for a moment. "How bad?" Cord asked finally. "Don't know yet. Hale will tell her to stay off it. She won't." "No," Cord agreed. "She won't." The diagnosis, delivered through Walter when he came back out to the porch 20 minutes later, was a hairline fracture in the lateral bone and moderate ligament damage. Not surgical, not permanent, but real, and requiring actual rest, which everyone on the property understood was going to be the most difficult part of the recovery. Hale left splinting materials and instructions. He said 6 weeks minimum before riding. He said this directly to Vivian, which took some nerve, and she received it with the expression of a woman filing information under noted but not binding, and said thank you in a voice that did not suggest she found the instruction particularly relevant to her plans. Ethan heard all of this the next morning from Pete, who had heard it from Walter, who had probably not intended it to travel that far. He spent the day on the fence line repairs he'd been planning for the west boundary, and thought about the 6 weeks ahead and what they would look like with Vivian grounded and Dunbar watching the north boundary with increasing boldness, and the spring work coming that would require more hands than they currently had. He thought about the problem the way he'd learned to think about problems on this ranch, looking at the pieces, looking at what connected them, looking for where the pressure was most likely to come from and what the response needed to be before it arrived. By the time he came back to the yard that evening, he had a rough shape of a plan. He did not have a chance to think about it more, because the next morning Dunbar moved. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about how Curtis Dunbar operated. He didn't announce himself, didn't posture, didn't ride up to the gate and make speeches. He was smarter than that. What he did was quiet and precise and specifically timed, and the timing told Ethan everything he needed to know about how long Dunbar had been watching this ranch and waiting for the right moment. 3 things happened inside 48 hours. The first was that 2 of the ranch's hired hands, men who had been with Black Hollow less than a season, gave their notice on the same morning, citing personal reasons in tones that did not sound personal. They were gone before noon. Cord watched them ride out with his jaw set and said nothing in front of the remaining men. The second was that a section of fence on the eastern boundary, not the north where everyone was watching, but the east, which was the quiet side, the one nobody thought about, came down in a way that was not weather damage and not age. It was cut. Clean horizontal cuts through 3 strands of wire at a section hidden from the main yard by a stand of pine. Dunbar's cattle were through the gap and grazing on Mercer land by the time Garrett found it on his morning check. The third was that a man came to see Walter. Not Dunbar himself, someone else. a lawyer from the county seat with papers in a leather briefcase that he set on Walter's desk with the careful ceremony of a man who understands the weight of what he's carrying. Ethan didn't know what was in those papers until that evening, when Walter came to the barn where Ethan was working late and sat down on a hay bale with the weight of a man who had been carrying something all day and needed to put it down. He filed on the watcher rights, Walter said. Ethan set down his tools. The Northern Creek drainage, Walter continued. Dunbar's lawyer is claiming the original land grant gave his property riparian rights to the upper creek flow. If the claim holds, he can legally reduce the water coming to our north pasture to whatever's left after his property takes what it needs. He looked at his hands. In a dry spring or summer, that could mean almost nothing. Is the claim legitimate? My lawyer says it's arguable, which means it'll go to a judge, which means it could take a year to resolve, and in the meantime, you operate under uncertainty. In the meantime, every neighboring rancher in the valley knows we're in a legal fight and bleeding hands and have the north boundary under pressure. Walter's voice was steady, but thin. Dunbar knows what he's doing. He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to make the operation look unstable enough that our other creditors get nervous. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Does Vivian know? I told her an hour ago. How'd she take it? Walter almost laughed. It came out as something else, a sound that wasn't quite either thing, that lived in the space between exhaustion and grim appreciation. She told me to get her crutches and get Cord in the office immediately. He looked at Ethan. She also told me to ask you to come. Ethan stood up. The office meeting that night lasted 2 hours, and it was not a comfortable meeting. Vivian sat behind the desk with her ankle elevated and her eyes at full operational intensity, which meant nobody in the room was under any illusion that the fracture had slowed down anything that mattered. Cord stood near the window. Walter sat in the corner chair that was becoming more and more his corner. Ethan stood near the door because that was where he'd positioned himself and nobody had told him to sit down. She went through it methodically. The fence sabotage, the departing hands, the water rights claim. She laid it out without editorializing, building the map of what Dunbar was doing the way she mapped everything, functionally, looking at the shape before deciding what to do about the shape. He's isolating us, she said. Reducing our capacity, making us look weak, giving the valley a reason to think Black Hollow is in trouble. Which makes Walter's other creditors nervous, Ethan said. Which puts pressure on the land itself, she finished. Yes. Can we fight the water rights claim? Cord asked. Legally, yes. Practically, it'll cost money we'd rather not spend and take time we don't have. She was quiet for a moment, working through something. I want to concentrate on what we can control. The fence is repaired? Done today, Cord said. We need someone on the east boundary as part of the daily check, rotating, different men, different times, so there's no predictable window. She looked at Cord. Can we manage that with who we have? Thin, Cord said, especially with Reardon and Hobbs gone. Then we need to replace them. In March, in the middle of everything. I know when it is, Cord. I'm saying the timing's bad. The timing's bad because Dunbar made the timing bad, she said flatly. He picked it. We don't get to pick it back. She looked at Ethan. What are you thinking? He'd been thinking through it since Walter had come to the barn, running the pieces against each other, looking for what Dunbar couldn't control. The cattle drive, he said. Everyone looked at him. The spring rotation. You moved the northern herd down to the valley pastures. When? Second week of April, usually, Cord said. Dunbar's legal claim is on the creek drainage. His leverage disappears the moment the northern herd is off that pasture, because the water dispute becomes irrelevant to current operations. It's still a legal problem, but it stops being an operational crisis. Ethan looked at Vivian. If we move the drive up, do it before he expects it, before his claim has any practical teeth, we take that piece off the board. Vivian was already thinking ahead of him. He could see it in her face. The mountain route's still iced, she said. Parts of it. The Western Pass has been clearing faster than the main track. I've been watching it. You've been watching the Western Pass? Since January. She looked at him for a moment. The Western Pass adds 8 miles, and gets us to the valley floor without touching the creek drainage at all. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind was doing its usual business against the eaves. It's a risk, Cord said. night driving through a mountain pass that's still clearing in early April. It's a risk either way, Ethan said. Dunbar's counting on us waiting for the standard route to clear. He's counting on another 3 weeks of pressure while we sit here and look uncertain. If we move the herd next week, we move it on our timeline, not his. Cord looked at Vivian. Walter looked at his hands. The clock on the office wall marked the silence with its quiet mechanism. I want to look at the Western Pass myself before we decide, Vivian said. Your ankle. I can ride in a wagon. Cord can drive. She said it in the tone that closed the discussion. Then she looked at Ethan again, and something in the look was the specific kind of acknowledgement she gave when she'd decided someone was right but wasn't going to make a ceremony of it. If the pass is passable, we move in 6 days. 6 days was not a lot of time to prepare a cattle drive that usually had 2 weeks of lead work. Every person on the ranch understood that when Vivian made the decision 3 days later, standing in the wagon bed at the mouth of the Western Pass with Cord holding the horse, and Ethan 20 feet ahead on foot testing the footing on the switchback section, her ankle wrapped and her expression doing that controlled assessment thing it did, and she looked at the terrain and looked at Ethan and said, "Tell me what you see." He walked the first 100 yards of the switchback and came back. First section's solid. The upper traverse still has ice on the north face, but it's not continuous. There are dry patches you can work through if you angle the drive right. The descent to the valley floor is the cleanest part. He looked at her. It's manageable. It won't be easy. Nothing here is easy, she said. No. She was quiet for another moment, looking at the pass, and he watched her make the decision. Not the visible surface of it, but the actual internal weight shift of a person choosing to commit to a risk because the alternative is worse. He recognized it because he'd made versions of that same decision several times in his life. And it always looked the same from the outside. Calm, deliberate, entirely alone with it, even when surrounded by people. 6 days, she said again. And that was that. The preparation was brutal, relentless, and short on sleep. Ethan ran most of it alongside Cord, managing the logistics of moving roughly 200 head of cattle through a mountain pass that hadn't been used for a spring drive in years. They needed extra rope, specific equipment for the traverse section, a careful sequence to the cattle movement that would prevent bunching at the narrow points. He recruited Garrett and Tom Sully for the point positions, put Pete in the swing despite Pete's vocal uncertainty about the assignment, and spent 2 evenings walking the first mile of the pass on foot in the dark with a lantern, memorizing it. He wrote to Noah during those 6 days, a letter he wasn't sure when he'd send. He wrote about the drive, about the mountains, about what it felt like to be planning something large and necessary and risky. He wrote, "This ranch has gotten under my skin in a way I didn't plan for. I think you'd like it here. I think you'd like the people." He wrote, "I'm working on soon. I'm still working on it." He didn't send that letter right away. He folded it and added it to the stack with the others, the ones that told the story of this winter in pieces. The night before the drive, Dunbar made one more move. A man came to the gate. A different man this time, bigger, with the deliberate quality of someone sent to communicate something physical without technically doing anything physical, and asked to speak with the owner of the property. Cord met him at the gate. The man said his employer had a revised offer for the northern grazing rights, and that the offer was time-sensitive, and that it would not be available after the following week. Cord said he'd relay the message. Then he came and found Ethan in the barn, finishing the last equipment check for the drive. "He's nervous," Ethan said when Cord told him. "Dunbar? He wouldn't be making offers the night before a drive he doesn't know about if he wasn't nervous." Ethan tightened a rope coil and hung it on the wall. "He must have a source somewhere in the valley who told him something's moving." "Can't stop that kind of talk," Cord said. "No. But it means we move exactly on schedule before he can reposition." Ethan looked at him. "We leave at 3. Cord held his eye. "You know if this goes wrong, It won't go wrong. You can't know that." "No," Ethan said, "but I know the pass and I know the cattle, and I know every man riding tomorrow." He paused. "That's enough." Cord looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has been on this land long enough to know that confidence and competence are different things, and that this particular man had both, which was rarer than people acknowledged. 3 o'clock, Cord said, and left. Vivian found him at 2:15, standing at the entrance to the cattle pen in the dark, doing a last count. He heard her crutches before he saw her, the uneven rhythm of them on the frozen ground. "You should be inside," he said. "So should you." She stopped beside him and looked at the cattle, dark shapes moving slowly in the pen. "I want to ride the first section." "No." "Ethan, your ankle's in a splint and the first section has the switchback." He said it without heat, without apology. "I need every person on that drive to be able to react fast on rough terrain. You can't do that right now." She was quiet for a moment. He could feel the quality of the silence, the frustration in it, the specific frustration of a person who knows they're being told the right thing and hates that they can't argue against it. "I should be on that drive," she said. "I know. This is my ranch. These are my cattle." "I know that too. And you're telling me to stay behind and watch." He turned to look at her. She was looking straight ahead at the cattle, her jaw tight, her hands gripping the crutches with a force that had nothing to do with balance. "I'm telling you that the best thing you can do for this ranch tonight is trust the people who are doing this for you." He paused. "You trust Cord?" "Yes." "You trust Garrett and Tom?" "Yes." He waited. She looked at him. The darkness between them was thin and cold, and the cattle moved in the pen with that particular low, restless sound of animals who know something is happening. "I trust you," she said. Quietly. Simply. Like it was a fact she'd been carrying around for a while and had finally just set down out loud because it was getting heavy. He held that for a second. "Then let us bring your cattle home," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she gave a short, sharp nod and turned and went back toward the house, the uneven rhythm of her crutches fading across the yard. He watched her go. Then he went to saddle Sable. The drive started at 3 in the morning under a sky that was clear and brutal and stacked with stars in the way of high-altitude nights in early spring, and everything that could go wrong in the first 2 hours did go wrong in small ways that required immediate responses and offered no credit for the fixing. 3 cattle broke left at the pen exit and needed 20 minutes and considerable language to redirect. The second water break was blocked by a deadfall that hadn't been there when Ethan had walked the pass the previous week, and they lost 40 minutes clearing it. Pete's horse threw a shoe in the dark on the lower section, and Garrett had to handle Pete's position for an hour, while Pete managed on foot, complaining with impressive creativity. None of it was fatal. None of it stopped the drive. Ethan moved between point and flank and back to center as the situation required, keeping the column moving, communicating with Cord through signals they'd worked out over the previous days, watching the terrain ahead with the specific focus of someone who has put his name behind a decision and is now living inside it. The cold was extraordinary at altitude, the kind that got into the gaps in your gear and made itself permanent, and by the time they hit the traverse section, every man was carrying a full-body exhaustion layered under the adrenaline of the work. The traverse was the section he'd been most worried about, and it earned the worry. The ice on the north face was worse than his last walkthrough. The temperature had dropped 3 degrees in the week since, and the patches he'd mapped as manageable had connected and grown. There was a continuous stretch of roughly 60 yards where the footing was genuinely dangerous, and moving 200 cattle across it in the dark required the kind of collective patience and precision that you couldn't manufacture or demand. You could only hope the men and animals you had were up to it. They were, mostly. They lost 2 steers on the traverse, not to injury, but to a gap in the left flank coverage where the terrain pushed the column wider than expected, and 2 animals found an alternate downslope route that they were committed to before anyone could redirect them. Ethan made the call to let them go and recover them in daylight, rather than chase them into worse terrain in the dark. And that was the right call. And it cost him something to make it because they were Vivian's cattle, and every animal that came off this mountain counted. The descent to the valley floor began at 5:40, the sky beginning its first gray shift from black. And by 6:15, the lead cattle were on flat ground and moving well, and Cord appeared at Ethan's shoulder and said absolutely nothing, which from Cord was the same as a standing ovation. They reached the Spring Valley pasture at 7:22 in the morning. The counting took 40 minutes. 196 head of cattle standing in the valley grass, the Carver Mountains behind them pink and gold with the first real light of the day. 2 short of the full count, the Traverse strays, who turned up 2 days later, unhurt, grazing in a protected draw a mile east, and came in without incident. Ethan sat on Sable at the pasture fence and watched the cattle spread into the grass and felt the exhaustion hit him all at once, the full weight of the night dropping onto his shoulders like something he'd been holding up by force and had finally let down. He was too tired to feel triumphant. He just felt the particular emptiness that comes after something hard is done. Not peace exactly, but the absence of the pressure that had been there, a kind of silence where the urgency used to be. Pete pulled up beside him. He was filthy, short a horseshoe, red-faced from the cold, and grinning in a way that his face could barely contain. "We did it," Pete said. "We did it," Ethan agreed. "You think Dunbar knows yet?" Ethan looked north toward the mountains, toward Black Hollow and the valley beyond it, and the Dunbar property sitting on its northern edge like a problem that hadn't been solved yet, just temporarily outmaneuvered. "He will soon enough," Ethan said. News moved the way news always moved in that valley, through the general store and the feed merchant and the Saturday mail run, and by the end of the week the story had reached every ranch in the territory, adjusting in each retelling as stories do, but retaining the essential shape of the thing, that Black Hollow had moved 200 cattle through the Western Pass in early April, at night, without losing a single animal to injury, and had done it while running lean and under external pressure from the Dunbar operation. The valley that had spent the winter watching Dunbar squeeze the Mercer property went quiet for a few days, recalibrating. Then it started talking differently. Old Hatch at the feed merchant told his customers that he'd heard the Mercer operation had a foreman, not an official title, but functionally, who had walked that pass in the dark and brought the cattle through on schedule when most operations would have waited another month for easier conditions. Mrs. Hallett at the general store had a more complete version of events that she shared with whoever came through her door, and her account, which was largely accurate because she had good sources, emphasized not just the drive itself, but everything that had preceded it. The winter work, the fence sabotage, the Dunbar offer that had been refused, the ice on the North Ridge, and who had gone after who. The valley hadn't seen Ethan Cade as anything particular when he'd arrived in October, just another hand at a ranch that went through hands. It saw him differently now, not as a drifter, not as a temporary man, but as someone who had chosen Black Hollow when Black Hollow was under pressure and had made it count. 3 days after the drive, Curtis Dunbar withdrew the water rights claim. It was filed quietly, no announcement, just a legal retraction delivered to Walter's lawyer in town with no accompanying explanation. Walter came to find Ethan in the field the same afternoon, walking across the pasture with a steadiness in his step that Ethan hadn't seen in months. "He withdrew," Walter said. Ethan kept working the section of fence he was reinforcing. "I figured he would." "Why?" "Because the claim was leverage, not law. Once the cattle were off the north pasture, the leverage didn't leverage anything anymore." He drove a post spike and tested it. "He'll find another angle eventually. Men like Dunbar don't stop. But he won't find one that looks this clean again." Walter stood there for a moment, watching him work. The spring sun was doing its actual job for the first time that year. Not just light, but warmth, real warmth, the kind that changes what the world looks like. "I owe you something," Walter said. "You pay me $40 a month." "I mean something else." Ethan looked up at him. Walter looked back with those steady old eyes that had been watching this valley for 60 years and watching this particular situation for 6 months and had, Ethan suspected, understood the shape of it before Ethan had understood it himself. "She hasn't been wrong about much in her life," Walter said. "But she's been wrong about needing people. She's been wrong about that for a long time." He paused. "I don't know if you two are going to figure that out or not. That's not mine to manage." He looked out across the pasture. "But whatever happens, you've done right by this place. By her." He met Ethan's eyes one more time. "I won't forget that." He turned and walked back toward the house. Ethan stood there in the new warmth of the April afternoon, the valley spread green and gold around him, the mountains standing where they always had, indifferent to human drama, unchanged by winter or spring or anything as small as the concerns of people working the land at their feet. He drove the next post spike, and the next, and the next. That evening, Vivian came to find him at the western fence line as the light was going gold and long across the grass. She was on crutches still, but moving with more confidence on them now, like she'd decided to stop resenting them and just use them. She stopped a few feet away and looked at the pasture and at the mountains beyond and at nothing specific, the way you look at something you've been fighting for long enough that you've almost forgotten what it looks like at rest. Cord told me what the drive cost, she said. The 2 strays on the Traverse, the decisions you made. I'd make the same ones again. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I heard what you said to them before you left. The men. He waited. You told them they were doing it for the ranch. She looked at him. Pete told me? Because Pete tells everyone everything. That's true. You didn't say they were doing it for me. He met her eyes. You are the ranch, he said. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences they usually shared. Warmer, less defended, like something that had been under pressure for a long time had finally been given enough room to just be what it was. She didn't say anything for a while. My father thinks a lot of you, she said finally. The feeling's mutual. So does Cord, which is... She almost smiled. Cord doesn't think a lot of most people. I know. She looked at him. The last of the day's light was on her face, and she wasn't guarding against it, wasn't managing her expression with the usual precision. She looked tired and real, and like someone who had been carrying a very specific weight for a very long time and had just noticed for the first time that she didn't have to carry it entirely alone. Thank you, she said. The same 2 words she'd said from across a yard weeks ago. But they meant something different now, carried more freight, said more than just thank you for a specific thing. You don't have to thank me, he said. I know I don't have to. She held his eyes. I want to. The spring evening settled around Black Hollow Ranch. The cattle in the valley pasture, the mountains holding their color, the yard behind them going quiet in the way of a place that has been through a hard season and is finally, cautiously, beginning to believe the hard part might be done. Neither of them moved for a while. They just stood there at the fence line, 2 people who had spent a winter earning each other's trust one hard day at a time, watching the last of the light leave the sky. Spring in Wyoming doesn't apologize for what winter was. It just arrives, practical and unhurried, turning the mud back into ground, and the brown back into green, and the frozen creek back into something with a voice. Black Hollow Ranch absorbed the change the way it absorbed everything, by keeping working, because the season didn't wait, and the land didn't care what you'd just been through. But something had shifted in the yard, in the rooms, in the air between people. Things that had been held at careful distance were no longer quite as far away. Ethan felt it every day without being sure what to do with it. The space between him and Vivian had changed character after the evening at the fence line. Not dramatically. There was no single conversation that resolved anything, no declaration, no moment where they looked at each other and said out loud what had been building since October. That wasn't who either of them was. What changed was smaller and more real than that. The way she stopped calculating whether to trust him with information and just trusted him. The way he stopped moderating how much he cared about the outcome of decisions that were technically not his to care about. They had moved, without announcing it, from 2 people working the same land into something that didn't have a clean word yet, but that everyone on the property could see and had apparently decided to say nothing about out of either tact or self-preservation. Pete had shown remarkable restraint on the subject, which Ethan suspected was costing him physically. The ankle healed slower than Vivian wanted and faster than Dr. Hale expected, which was about right for her. She was off the crutches by the 3rd week of April and back on a horse by early May, though she rode with a guard wrap for another 3 weeks, and Ethan noticed without saying anything that she'd quietly adjusted her boundary inspection routes to avoid the North Ridge Traverse until the ice was fully gone. He didn't mention it. There was no reason to mention it. People adjust after things go wrong, and that's not weakness. That's just the body remembering what the mind would prefer to forget. The spring work was enormous and relentless, in the way spring work on a cattle ranch always is. The accumulated, deferred maintenance of winter crashing into the new season's demands all at once. The western fence replacement that Ethan had promised in October finally happened in the 1st week of May. A 4-day project that left his shoulders wrecked and his hands a new kind of damaged. The cattle shelter roof got its full replacement. The eastern boundary got a new fence line, properly posted, in a project Vivian oversaw from horseback on the 2nd day once she was cleared to ride. Directing the placement with the precision of someone who had been visualizing the correct version of this fence for 2 years and was not about to accept an approximation. It was on the 3rd day of the fence project that Ethan told her about Noah. Not that he hadn't mentioned the boy before. She knew he had a son. The whole ranch knew. It was not a secret. But he hadn't talked about him in front of her as something real, as something present and specific rather than an abstract future arrangement. He hadn't told her what Noah sounded like, what he thought about, what he drew, what he'd said in the last letter that had arrived the previous Thursday and that Ethan had read twice standing in the yard before folding it carefully and putting it in his coat. He didn't plan to tell her. They were standing at the eastern fence line and she was measuring the post spacing and he was working the post driver and he said, out of no particular context, "Noah wants to know what the cattle look like." She looked up from the measuring tape. "My son," he said, though she knew. "I know who Noah is." She studied him for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I tried to describe them. He's not satisfied with descriptions. He's the kind of kid who needs to see things for himself." Ethan set the driver down and looked at the herd visible in the south pasture from where they were standing. "He draws horses. He's been drawing horses since he could hold a pencil. Every letter I get from him has at least one horse in it." "Is he accurate?" "Getting better." Ethan almost smiled. The first ones looked like dogs that had given up. She looked at the cattle for a moment. Then she looked at him. "When are you going to bring him here?" The question landed in a way he hadn't expected, Moshkes. Not as a practical inquiry, but as something else. Something that assumed a future with shape and specific detail. Something that said here, like here, was the destination, not just a place he was passing through. "I've been saving since October," he said carefully. "That's not what I asked." He met her eyes. The spring light was sharp and clean out here on the open boundary. No softening, just the thing itself. "I don't know exactly," he said. I needed to know what I was bringing him into, what the situation was. Before I told him, this is where we're going." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "And now?" "Now I think I know." She held his look for a long beat. Something in her face that was trying to stay neutral and not entirely succeeding. "He should come soon," she said. "Summer's the best time to see this place." She went back to measuring the post spacing, and Ethan went back to the post driver, and neither of them said anything else about it. But the conversation had happened, and it sat between them for the rest of the day with the particular weight of something that has been said out loud and cannot be unsaid, which is not a bad weight. Just a real one. He wrote to Margaret that night. "Bring him south," he wrote. "I'll send money for the travel. Tell him to bring his drawing paper." He had a letter back within 10 days. Margaret had read Noah the relevant parts. The part about coming, about summer, about the drawing paper. And Noah had apparently responded by drawing a picture of himself on a horse that she included in the envelope and that showed, Ethan noted, considerable improvement. The horse's legs were the right number and pointing in the right directions. The man on the horse had a hat that was larger than his entire torso but was clearly meant with love. He showed it to Vivian without really deciding to. He just found himself holding it out across the desk in the barn office where they'd been going over the summer supply orders, and she took it and looked at it, and something in her expression went quiet and careful in the way of a person encountering something unexpectedly tender and not being sure what to do with that reaction in front of someone else. "He's good," she said. "The hat's the size of a barn door. He has the proportions of the horse right." She handed it back. "That's harder than the hat." He looked at the drawing for a moment before folding it. "He's going to love this place," he said. Quietly. Not to her specifically, just true. She said nothing, but she didn't look away. June arrived, and with it a different quality of days. Longer, warmer, the valley showing its best version of itself, the way hard places do in summer, like they've been holding something back all the cold months and have finally decided to let you see it. The cattle moved well on the summer pastures. The fence held. The water moved cleanly through the drainage that had been the subject of Dunbar's claim, undisputed, as it had always done. Dunbar himself was a quieter presence now. He hadn't stopped being what he was, a man who wanted land that wasn't his and had the patience and resources to wait for his moment, but the moment he'd architected over the winter had not materialized the way he'd planned, and that failure had a cost to his reputation in the valley that functioned better than any legal response could have. People in small territories have long memories for who pushed and who held, and the story of Black Hollow's spring drive had settled into the valley's informal record in a way that would not be revised soon. Curtis Dunbar did not send any more messengers to the gate. Walter Mercer had a quiet word with his lawyer about proactively documenting the water rights history, not because he expected another challenge, but because Ethan had suggested that documenting the unchallenged record was better than responding to a challenge after it arrived. Walter thought this was sensible. He did it. There was also the question of the ranch's formal structure, which Walter raised in the office on a Thursday evening in mid-June with the directness of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had decided to stop deferring it. Ethan was in the office at Walter's request, sitting across the desk from the old man, who had a document in front of him that he didn't immediately explain. "I'm not dying," Walter said, which was not the most reassuring opening. "I want to be clear about that." "Okay," Ethan said, "but I'm 61, and my heart's not what it was, and this ranch has been running on my daughter's back for 3 years, and I've been signing papers she should be signing." He looked at the document. "I want to make the operational authority formal, legal, her name on the decisions that are already hers." He looked up. "I also want to make a case for your role here. I'm a ranch hand. You're not a ranch hand anymore, and you know it." Walter said this without harshness, just the flat precision of someone stating a fact that everyone else had already accepted. "What you've been doing here since November is not a ranch hand's job. I want to formalize a partnership structure, operational, not ownership, unless that changes later, that gives you standing to make decisions when Vivian needs backup." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's her decision. I spoke to her this morning." Walter paused. "She told me to ask you." Something moved in Ethan's chest, quiet and significant. "She wants to know if you're staying," Walter said. Simply, like it was that simple. Like after all of it, that was the actual question. Ethan looked at the man across the desk. The weathered face, the old hands, the eyes that had been watching this valley and this particular situation with the patience of someone who understood that most things worth having take time and cannot be forced. He thought about the morning in October when he'd sat on the ridge above this place and studied the fence lines and the restless cattle and the barn roof that needed work, and had felt something he hadn't expected, the particular pull of a place that needed exactly what he happened to have. He thought about the winter, the cold, the work, the drive through the mountain pass in the dark. He thought about Noah's drawing in his coat pocket and the letter he'd already sent north. "I'm staying," he said. Walter nodded. Like he'd known. Like he'd known for a long time and had just been waiting for Ethan to be ready to say it out loud. "Good," he said, and signed his name at the bottom of the document. Noah arrived on a Saturday afternoon in the first week of July, on the afternoon stage from the junction town 40 miles north, where Ethan had ridden out to meet him. He was 7 years old and small for it, and had his mother's dark eyes and Ethan's jaw and a personality that announced itself immediately, loud, curious, incapable of pretending to be interested in anything he wasn't actually interested in, and incapable of hiding his interest in things that genuinely captured him. The moment Ethan lifted him down from the stage and the boy looked around at the territory around the junction town, the space of it, the mountains visible in every direction, the scale of the sky, he went completely still for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "It's bigger than you said." "I said it was big." "You didn't say this big." He looked at his father. "Can I see the horses?" They rode back to Black Hollow together, Noah on a borrowed gentle mare that Ethan had arranged in advance, and the boy handled the horse with the natural ease of someone who had been drawing horses for years and had developed a proprietary relationship with the concept. He talked most of the way, about Margaret's house, about his friend Danny, about a book he'd been reading, about a question he had about how mountains got to be mountains that Ethan answered as best he could, and that Noah found partially satisfying. They came over the ridge above Black Hollow Ranch as the afternoon light was going long and gold, and Ethan stopped his horse at the same point where he'd stopped his first morning in October, looking down at the buildings, the cattle pens, the barn, the main house with its dark timber, the fence lines running out in every direction across the land. Noah stopped beside him and looked. He was quiet for longer than usual. "Is this ours?" he said. Ethan looked at his son. "We live here," he said. "It's a little different from ours. But we live here." "Yeah." Noah looked at the ranch for another moment. "Okay," he said, with the finality of a child who has made a decision and closed the door on any alternative. Then he clicked his heels against the mare's sides and started down the ridge. Ethan watched him go for just a moment before following. The introduction of Noah to Black Hollow Ranch was, in the specific and unrepeatable way of children being introduced to working places, both chaotic and immediately successful. Pete took to the boy within the first hour with the energy of a man who had always wanted a younger brother and now had one, whether or not anyone had agreed to the arrangement. Garrett showed him the cattle without being asked, walking him along the pasture fence with the same quiet seriousness he applied to everything, and Noah asked questions that Garrett answered with a patience he didn't always show adults. The Sully brothers taught him a card game of questionable educational value on the second evening. Cord assessed him the way Cord assessed everyone, through extended observation and minimal conversation. And on the third morning, apparently having concluded something favorable, handed Noah a small task involving the water buckets that the boy completed with intense seriousness and considerable spillage, and then looked up from with an expression of absolute accomplishment. Vivian met him on the first afternoon, in the yard between the barn and the main house. Ethan had not engineered the meeting. He'd been down at the south pasture when it apparently happened, and he heard about it later from Pete, who had witnessed it from the bunkhouse window. Noah had wandered into the yard by himself with his drawing paper and his pencil, sat down in the dirt near the fence post, and started drawing what he could see: the barn, the mountains behind it, the line of fence running north. He'd been there for 20 minutes when Vivian came out of the barn and found him. She'd stopped, according to Pete, and looked at him for a moment. Then she'd walked over and crouched beside him. Her ankle still not entirely easy with that, but she'd done it and looked at the drawing. "That's the north barn," she said. "I know," Noah said, without looking up. "The roof is complicated. I can't get it right." She looked at the drawing, then at the actual roof. "The pitch changes on the east side," she said. "See where the addition connects? That's why it doesn't look even." Noah looked at the roof, then at his drawing, then made a correction with his pencil. "Better," he said. "Better," she agreed. Pete reported that they'd sat there together for another 10 minutes while Noah drew and Vivian occasionally pointed out something he'd missed, and that the whole thing had the specific quality of two people who were going to understand each other without requiring a lot of preamble. When Ethan came back to the yard and found them there, his son cross-legged in the dirt, Vivian crouching beside him, looking at a drawing of the barn. Something happened in him that he didn't have a word for, something that lived below language, below the territory of sentences, in the place where the things that actually matter are stored. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked at them for a moment. Then Noah saw him and held up the drawing. "She helped me with the roof," he said. "I can see that," Ethan said. Vivian stood up slowly and looked at him across the yard. The afternoon light was on her face, same as always out here with no shelter from it, and she wasn't managing her expression. She just let him see it. He crossed the yard toward them. The conversation that actually changed things between Ethan and Vivian happened 3 weeks into July, late on a Sunday evening when the ranch was quiet and Noah was asleep in the room Walter had given him in the main house, a decision that had surprised Ethan until Walter explained, in the tone of a man who is not going to elaborate, that the bunkhouse was no place for a 7-year-old. They were sitting on the porch of the main house, the two of them, which had become a quiet habit that nobody had announced. The valley below was dark and enormous, and the sky above it was doing what Wyoming skies did on clear summer nights, turning into something almost unreasonable in its scale and clarity. She said, without particular lead-up, "I trusted someone 11 years ago." Ethan waited. He came through the valley. He seemed like the kind of person who meant what he said. She was looking at the dark beyond the porch, not at him. He talked about the ranch like it mattered to him, like I mattered to him. She paused. He left in April. Just left. He took some money from the supply account on the way out. Not a lot, but enough. "Vivian, I'm telling you this because—" She stopped, started again. "Because I've been unfair to you. Not wrong exactly about being careful, but unfair." She finally looked at him. "You've been here since October and you have been exactly who you showed yourself to be from the first day. I know that. I've known it for months." Her voice was controlled, but not easy. This was costing her something and she knew it and was paying it anyway. "I'm not good at this." "At what?" She made a small gesture with her hand that was probably meant to encompass the entire complicated situation. Any of this. Neither am I, he said. Honestly? She looked at him. You seem like you are. I'm not. I'm just not afraid of it the way I used to be. He paused. I was married. It ended badly. Not violently. Nothing like that. Just badly. She left when Noah was 4. I spent 2 years deciding whether I was the kind of man who gives up on the idea of a life with someone in it or the kind who keeps trying. He looked out at the dark. I haven't been trying. Not until this year. The night sounds of the ranch moved around them. Cattle distant and low, a horse shifting in the stable, the creek audible somewhere below the south field. Noah likes it here, she said. He loves it here. He asked me yesterday if I knew how to shoe a horse. She paused. I told him yes. He asked me to teach him. He tells you things he doesn't tell me yet, Ethan said. I think he's testing whether I'm staying, she said, and then heard what she'd said and what it mirrored, and something moved across her face that was close to the expression she'd had on the porch in February. Real and unguarded, before she could manage it back. Are you? He said quietly. She looked at him. I built this place, she said. I'm not going anywhere. That's not what I asked. She held his eyes. The darkness between them was warm for once. July air, summer, the specific softness of a night that isn't trying to kill you. No, she said. It's not. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. I don't know how to do this without being afraid of it. I know. I'm telling you in advance so you're not surprised when I'm difficult. You've been difficult since October, he said. I'm still here. She looked at him for a moment, and then something happened to her face that he had not seen before. Not the almost smile that surfaced occasionally in unguarded moments, but an actual one. Uncontrolled, unlaunched, just there, changing the whole architecture of her expression into something that made her look younger and more tired and more real all at once. You're annoying, she said. You're the second person to tell me that today. The first was your father. She laughed. A real one, short and surprised, the kind you can't plan. And then she recovered it and looked back out at the valley. But the smile was still there at the edge, and she let it stay. Walter formalized the operational documents in August. Vivian's name on the deed as co-owner, alongside her father. A correction of the omission that had always been technically legal, but never quite just. Ethan's name on a formal partnership agreement, operational manager, with standing to make decisions in Vivian's absence and her full authority in matters of ranch operations. It was paper catching up with what had already been true for months. Walter signed his portions and handed the pen to Vivian, and she signed hers. And the whole thing took 11 minutes and was less ceremonial than buying a horse. Afterward, Walter poured 3 measures of whiskey without being asked, and handed them out and raised his glass. To not having to do that twice, he said. They drank. That fall, the valley saw the Mercer operation differently than it ever had. Not because of ceremony or announcement, but because of the visible fact of it. The ranch running with a capacity and stability that spoke for itself. The cattle healthy and well managed, the operations efficient, the property in better shape than it had been in years. Neighboring ranchers who had been watching the Dunbar pressure with the cautious calculation of men deciding which way to lean stopped leaning toward Dunbar and started engaging Black Hollow as the solid operation it had become. Curtis Dunbar didn't disappear. Men like that don't disappear. But he pulled back to his property and stayed there, and the northern boundary was quiet through fall and into winter, and the quiet, after everything, felt earned. Noah started school in the town 3 miles east in September, which required a daily ride that he treated as the best part of his day, rather than an inconvenience, which Ethan suspected had less to do with school itself and more to do with the horse. He was 8 now, taller, with opinions about cattle management that he delivered to Cord with an earnestness that Cord had learned to receive with a straight face. He could shoe a horse, or the beginning of one, the first steps, because Vivian had taught him on 3 consecutive Sunday mornings in September, and he'd been accurate about how important that would be to him. He called her Vivian because that was her name. He never called her anything else, and she never asked him to. But there was a quality to how he moved toward her, how he looked for her when he came in from school, how he brought her drawings before he showed them to anyone else. That was its own language, without a word for it, and none of them tried to put one on it. The wedding happened on a Saturday afternoon in October, 1 year and 5 days after Ethan had ridden over the ridge and first looked down at Black Hollow Ranch. They did it at the western fence line, the rebuilt section, the one Ethan had repaired the first time in October, and had promised to properly replace in spring, and had replaced in spring. It felt right, without being sentimental about why. It was small. Walter. Cord, who shook Ethan's hand before the proceedings and said nothing, and whose eyes were doing things his face refused to. Pete, who cried openly and without apology and explained to no one in particular that he had allergies, which was a lie nobody challenged. Garrett and Tom Sully in clean shirts. Mrs. Hallett from the general store, who had apparently been invited by Walter on the basis that she'd been narrating the story of these two people to the whole valley for a year and deserved to see the ending. Noah stood next to Ethan in a shirt that was slightly too big for him, holding the rings in his closed fist with the concentration of someone entrusted with something that matters. There was no ceremony in any formal sense. A traveling judge handled the legal portion in about 4 minutes. The rest was just the fact of two people standing next to each other in the afternoon light on the land they had fought for together, and saying true things to each other in plain language and meaning them. Vivian was not a woman who performed anything. She stood in front of Ethan in the October sun with the mountains behind her and the valley spread below, and she looked at him the way she looked at everything that mattered, directly, completely, without the armor. And she said, "I spent 11 years building walls, and they kept me safe, and they kept me alone, and I'm done with alone." She paused. "You're difficult to be around." Beside Ethan, Noah whispered, "Is that part of the vows?" "Apparently," Ethan whispered back. "You're difficult to be around," Vivian repeated with more warmth, "because you're honest, and you don't quit, and you're the only person I've ever had to stop pretending with." She looked at him. "I don't want to pretend with anyone else for the rest of my life." Ethan took her hands. He thought about what to say. He'd thought about it for days, and nothing had come that felt right. That didn't sound like something borrowed from a better speaker than him. So he said what was true, in the simplest form. "I came over that ridge a year ago with nothing I was proud of and a list of things I needed to fix, and I ended up somewhere I didn't expect." He looked at her. "I ended up staying, and every reason I stayed is standing right in front of me." Noah still holding the rings. "That's me too, right?" "That's you too," Ethan said. "Okay," Noah said, satisfied. Nobody in the valley said the word love as though it were simple, because it isn't. It is a thing built from small repeated choices. From choosing to stay when leaving is easier, from choosing honesty when performance is safer, from choosing to let someone see you clearly even when being seen clearly has hurt you before. It is built slowly and knocked down fast, and rebuilt again by people stubborn enough to believe the rebuilding is worth the cost. Ethan Cade had spent 3 years believing he was the kind of man things happened to. He'd been wrong. He was the kind of man who showed up and worked with what was in front of him and did not stop. And that turned out to be everything. Vivian Mercer had spent 11 years believing that needing someone was the same as being weak. She'd been wrong too. Needing someone is just the truth, and the only choice is whether you're honest about it or whether you spend your whole life building walls against it and calling the walls strength. The walls came down. Not all at once. Not without cost. Not without moments when the fear was louder than everything else. But they came down. The valley changed with them, the way small places change when the people who anchor them change. Slowly, then all at once. Workers who had left Black Hollow over the years came back when the word spread that the operation was stable and the management was fair and the work was honest. The ranch hired 6 men in the spring following the wedding, the largest crew it had carried in a decade. The northern pastures produced well. The cattle were strong. The fence line that Ethan had promised to replace in spring of his first year was replaced properly, completely, and held through every winter after it without a single post failing. Noah turned 9 and then 10, and then the years started moving the way years move when you're not in survival mode anymore. Not slowly, not painfully, but with the swift, almost surprising quality of time that is being used well. He learned the ranch the way Vivian had learned it, all of it, the labor and the logic and the seasons and the land itself. He was not always easy. He was frequently too stubborn for his own good and occasionally too sure of himself, and he inherited from both of his parents the particular quality of being unable to let an unsolved problem alone until it was solved, which was exhausting in a child and would be an asset in an adult. Walter Mercer lived 7 more years past that October wedding. They were not easy years for his health, but they were good years, and he spent most of them on the porch in the afternoons watching the ranch that he had built, and that had almost broken, and that had come back stronger than it had ever been. On the last morning of his life, he asked Ethan to sit with him, and Ethan sat, and they talked about nothing specific: the cattle, the mountains, the way the light moved across the valley floor in October. And at some point, the talking stopped, and they just sat in the quiet together, which was enough. He was buried on the property, on the rise above the south pasture, where he'd told Vivian he'd always like to stand and look north toward the mountains. It was not easy. It was not supposed to be easy. Grief doesn't ask permission and doesn't follow a schedule, and Vivian carried hers the way she carried everything, by continuing to work, by continuing to show up, by occasionally sitting on the porch at night without saying anything while Ethan sat beside her and the valley held them both in the dark. What nobody had put in any document, what nobody had said in any ceremony or settled in any legal agreement, was the actual thing that held Black Hollow together. It wasn't the deed or the partnership papers or the rebuilt fence lines or even the cattle drive through the mountain pass in the dark. It was something simpler and more durable than all of those things. It was two people who had both been broken by the world in their own ways, who had both built their defenses and made their peace with being alone, who had looked at each other across a water trough on a cold October morning and begun, without knowing it, without deciding it, the long, imperfect, necessary work of choosing each other. Not once, every day. The way real things are always built, not perfectly, not without cost, but completely and without stopping, and with the particular stubbornness of people who have finally found something worth being stubborn about. The mountains held the sky above Black Hollow the same as they always had, indifferent and enormous, unchanged by any of it. But down in the valley, in the yard where children's voices eventually filled the same silence that grief had occupied for years, on the fence line where two people had stood in the October light and felt something shift between them, down there, something had changed that would not change back. And that was enough. That was, in the end, everything.